I walked out the morning I found the email. Not a dramatic exit, no shouting, no slamming doors, just my keys, my wallet, and the kind of silence that follows when everything you believed about your life turns out to be a careful construction of someone else's making. My name is Arthur Fenwick. I'm 63 years old. I live outside Bright, in the Victorian Alps, where the ash trees go gold in autumn and nobody much cares who you were before you arrived. I've been here 6 years now, long enough that the publican at the Bright Brewery knows my order. Long enough that my neighbor's dog stops barking when he hears my ute on the gravel. 6 years. That's how long it took my wife to find me. She didn't come alone. She brought a solicitor sharp suit, Brisbane address on the card, and a folder thick enough to suggest she'd been building her case for some time. She also brought a number, $340,000. That's what she said I owed her. That's what she said the courts would agree I owed her if I didn't settle quietly. She was standing in my driveway on a Tuesday morning in March, heels sinking into the loose gravel, looking at my modest weatherboard like it personally offended her. I was splitting kindling on the side of the house. I heard the car wrong sound for these mountains, too polished, too city, and came around the corner with the maul still in my hand. She looked exactly the same. That's the thing that catches you off guard. You expect time to have done something to a person who's destroyed you. You expect some mark of it on their face. But my wife looked as composed as she always had. Dark blazer, hair set, the expression she reserved for difficult negotiations. "Arthur," she said, "we need to have a conversation." The solicitor introduced himself as Derek Marsh. He spoke the way expensive solicitors do, measured, precise, with the particular confidence of a man who's rarely told no. He outlined what my wife called her position. 6 years of sole financial burden, 6 years of maintaining the family home, emotional distress, loss of consortium, the costs of raising our son, now 22, who had apparently spent those years believing his father had a breakdown and abandoned the family in a moment of selfish cowardice. I stood there in my work boots and flannel shirt and I listened. "Our marriage was over," he said. "But my obligations were not." "The documents prove your signature on the family home transfer," Derek said. "Your superannuation was liquidated 18 months after your departure. All of it properly filed, properly notarized. I never signed anything. We have county records suggesting otherwise," he said pleasantly. I looked at my wife. I tried to find something in her face, shame, maybe, hesitation. Something that acknowledged we both knew the truth of what had happened 6 years ago in that house in Toowoomba, in that study, on that Tuesday night when I came home early from a site inspection and read what I was never supposed to read. She held my gaze without flinching. "You walked away from your responsibilities," she said. "From me. From your son. You don't get to disappear and then act surprised when there are consequences." I told them both to leave. I gave them 48 hours. Derek left his card on my fence post. They drove back down the mountain. I stood in the gravel for a long time after the car was gone. My neighbor, Frank Oosterberg, was watching from his front porch across the road. He's 71, Vietnam vet, doesn't miss much. He didn't say anything, just gave me a slow nod, the way men of his generation do when they've seen something and want you to know they've seen it. Then, he went inside. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink, and I thought about the email. 6 years ago, I was 57. I ran a small construction consultancy out of Toowoomba. 30 years of building it, 2 employees, steady contracts with the regional council. My wife taught at the grammar school. We had a son, Mitchell, who was 16 at the time, doing well at school, good kid. We had a house on the escarpment with a garden my wife spent weekends on. We had, by any reasonable measure, a life. I came home on a Tuesday. She wasn't expecting me until Thursday. Her laptop was open on the kitchen bench. She'd gone to answer the door for a delivery, and the screen faced me when I walked past. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't looking for anything. The email was just there. It was from a man named Scott, and it was warm in the way that emails between people in love are warm, and specific in a way that made it immediately clear this had been going on for a long time. Years from what I could read. He mentioned things they'd done together, plans they were making. He mentioned, in one line that I've never fully managed to forget, that he was relieved the timing had worked out, and that they'd talk more about it when they were together that weekend. My wife had told me she was visiting her sister in Brisbane that weekend. She came back from the door and found me standing in the kitchen. She saw the screen. She saw my face. She didn't deny it. She said it was complicated. She said I'd been distant for years, that I'd chosen work over her, that she'd been lonely in ways I'd never bothered to notice. She said Scott understood her. She said she hadn't meant for it to happen. I asked how long. 4 years, she said. Mitchell was 12 when it started. While I was building a consultancy and thinking we had a solid life, she'd been 4 years into something else entirely. I asked her to end it. She said she wasn't sure she could. She said she needed time to think. She asked me not to do anything rash. I slept in the spare room. Then the next 2 nights. On the Friday, while she was in Brisbane or wherever she was, I packed my ute. I took my tools, my work files, my grandfather's watch, and a box of books. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen bench. I drove west, then south, then kept driving, until the landscape changed into something I didn't recognize, and the phone stopped buzzing. I ended up in Bright almost by accident. I had a mate from my early trade days who'd moved there years back. Barry Spate. Retired chippy. I called him from a servo outside Wangaratta and told him I needed a few days to clear my head. He said, "Come on then, the spare room's free." The few days turned into 3 months. Then I found the weatherboard for rent up in the hills, and that was that. I didn't contact Mitchell. That decision has sat with me every day since. I want to explain it, not excuse it. His mother told him, in the immediate aftermath, that I'd had some sort of episode, that I'd been struggling, that she didn't know where I was. I found this out later. From Barry, who'd heard it through mutual friends. By the time I knew what story he'd been given, 8 months had passed, and the version of events he'd been living with had calcified into something that felt like fact to him. I wrote him a letter once. Got halfway through it. Couldn't figure out how to say your mother had a 4-year affair, and I found out by accident to a 17-year-old who was already dealing with his father being gone. Felt like dropping a second bomb on someone still dealing with the first, so I didn't send it. That was the cowardice, if I'm honest. Not leaving. I stand by leaving. But the silence that followed, that I own. I drove to Wangaratta the next morning to find a community legal center. 2 hours each way. Mountain roads. The office was in a converted terrace on the high street carpet that needed replacing. A poster on the wall about renters' rights, the kind of fluorescent overhead light that makes everyone look slightly unwell. The solicitor who saw me was a young woman, late 30s, practical glasses, no-nonsense manner. Her name was Susan Calvert. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. The email, the 4 years, the departure, the 6 years of no contact. Then she clicked her pen. Do you have anything documented? The original email. The affair. Any communication from that period? No. I wanted a clean break. Didn't think I'd need to defend myself. She nodded slowly. The way people do when they're trying not to look worried. That's a problem. Without documentation, this becomes contested claims. And Mr. Fenwick, the fact that you left the family home and maintained no contact with your son for 6 years does look like abandonment, regardless of your reasons. What about the signatures? The super? I never authorized any of that. That's provable, potentially. But you'd need someone with access to the original financial records, your superannuation fund, your previous accountant, your bank. Anyone who can show the timeline doesn't match your stated involvement. I had a business partner, I said. Ian Dorset. We ran the consultancy together until I left. He managed the books. If the paperwork still exists from that period, it might show what the actual asset position was when I walked out. She wrote his name down. Contact him. Get whatever he has. Then come back. Walking out to my ute, I checked my phone. A text from an unknown number. Dad. Mum showed me the legal papers. You owe her $340,000. How could you do this to us? Mitchell, my son thought I was a thief. I sat in the car for 15 minutes with the engine off. Then I found Ian's number. We hadn't spoken since I'd called him from a servo outside Wangaratta 6 years ago and told him I was leaving. The business was his if he wanted it. There was a folder on the desk with everything he needed. He'd rung back twice in the following weeks. I hadn't answered. He picked up on the second ring. Arthur. Mate. It's really you. Yeah, I said. It's me. I need to ask a favor. I told him briefly. The lawsuit. The numbers. The forgery I suspected. There was a long silence. Right, he said finally. I've got everything. You know me. Never thrown out a file in my life. But Arthur, there's something you should probably know before we go any further. He sounded careful. The way people sound when they're about to tell you something you won't want to hear. She contacted me, he said. About 2 years after you left. Said she was trying to settle your estate. Said you'd had a breakdown and weren't capable of managing your affairs. Asked me to confirm certain things about the business value. And I didn't confirm anything. Told her I didn't have authority to discuss business records with anyone but you. But Arthur, she had a letter. Said it was from you. Authorizing her to act on your behalf. I didn't believe it was real. But I didn't have a way to prove it wasn't. His voice dropped. I should have done more. I should have tracked you down somehow and told you. I'm sorry. You didn't know. I should have tried harder to know. He paused. I'll get everything together. I'll come to you if I need to. Whatever it takes. I thanked him and hung up. I sat on my porch that evening watching the last light leave the ridge. Frank's veranda lamp was on across the road, steady as it always is. There's something reliable about that lamp. I've noticed it more nights than I could count. My phone buzzed again. Derek Marsh, the solicitor. 36 hours remaining, Mr. Fenwick. My client is prepared to be reasonable, but that window closes. Reasonable. The word almost made me laugh. The next morning, a woman appeared at Frank's door. She drove a silver hatchback with New South Wales plates. And she and Frank talked on his porch for about 20 minutes before she crossed the road and knocked on my gate. She was in her mid-60s, neat, white hair, the kind of sensible shoes that suggest a practical life. My name is Helen Quigley, she said. I used to work admin at St. Andrew's Grammar in Toowoomba, where your wife taught. She held out an envelope. I think you might need what's in here. Inside were photographs. Staff. Christmas parties. School fundraisers. Community events. Scott Parrish, I knew his name from the email, was in many of them. Standing close to my wife in the way that people who are careful don't stand close to each other. The dates on the back of the photos ran from 12 years ago to 2 years before I left. A decade of proximity documented. I'd seen them together for years, Helen said quietly. The way it wasn't hidden, exactly. Not to someone paying attention. She shook her head. When I heard she'd taken you to court, claiming you'd abandoned her, I couldn't stay quiet. Why come now? Why not 6 years ago? I didn't know where you were. She met my eyes. Frank's my cousin. I rang him last month. He mentioned you were dealing with something. She straightened. Good men don't always have someone in their corner. Sometimes they need to. After she left, I spread the photographs across my kitchen table. Susan Calvert rang that afternoon. Mr. Fenwick, your partner's records are extraordinary. The original asset schedule from when you left, it's completely inconsistent with the transfer documents she filed. The superannuation withdrawal records show she initiated the process herself, using what appears to be a forged power of attorney. Combined with what you've described, she's looking at potential fraud charges. Wire fraud, document forgery, false statutory declarations. She paused. But I have to be honest with you, her solicitor will argue that your departure and 6 years of no contact with your son creates a sympathetic narrative for her. A woman left alone, managing everything herself. Some judges find that compelling, even when the underlying facts don't support it. It'll be public, I said. Whatever it takes. Good. Because running from this won't end it. It'll just relocate it. That night, I sat in my ute with the engine running and the driveway gate open. I had mates in Western Australia, remote country. I knew a man who ran a fencing contracting business out of Kalgoorlie who'd offered me work twice over the years. I could be across the border in 2 days. I sat there a long time. Then Frank knocked on my passenger window. He was carrying a metal document box, the kind with a handle and a lock, and he looked at me with the flat directness of a man who's done his own version of this calculation before. Turn the engine off, he said. I've got something to show you. Frank, I said. I'm thinking about leaving. I know you are. He set the box on the bonnet and pulled out a key. He unlocked it. Inside were manila folders, labeled in his neat, deliberate handwriting. Dates, names, categories, property records, witness statements, school enrollment documents, photographs. What is this? He looked at me. The same look I'd seen across the road the morning my wife arrived. The look that had seen worse things and was still standing. 6 years ago, you moved in across the road with a ute full of tools and an expression I recognized. He opened the first folder. Man trying to outrun something. He paused. I had that look once, 50 years back. My wife left, took my daughter, told everyone I was the one who'd been difficult. I packed up and went north. Never fought it. Spent the next 15 years wondering if I'd made the right call. He set the folder in front of me. When you showed up, I decided if your situation looked like mine, I wasn't going to let you face it without ammunition. He closed the box lid. I drove to Toowoomba 4 times over 6 years. Talked to people at her school, at the council, at your old local. I found Helen, who had the photographs. I found 2 other teachers who'd seen things. I found your son's cricket coach from when Mitchell was 14, man named Paul Glendon, who told me your wife had brought Scott Parrish to at least 3 games before you'd even left. He met my eyes. I'm not rich. Took a fair bit of my savings to do this. But I'm 71 and single, and I'd rather spend it on something that matters. I looked at the mountain of careful, patient, years-long work he'd built. You can still leave, Frank said. Drive to Kalgoorlie. Start again. Nobody would blame you for it. But you won't go empty-handed now. You've got the truth, documented and ready. Mitchell is out there, I said. Thinking his father's a thief. Frank nodded. That's the only reason to stay. I turned off the engine, pulled out my phone, and rang Susan Calvert. I've got more documentation, I said when she answered. A lot more. Can you meet tomorrow? Frank's hand landed on my shoulder. Firm and brief. Mitchell was at his girlfriend's flat in Toowoomba when he found the box in his mother's garage. He'd come over to pick up some things he'd left behind, old footy gear, a textbook he needed. His girlfriend, Claire, was helping him look. His mother was out. The box was at the back of the 3rd shelf. behind Christmas decorations and a box of Mitchell's old-school reports. It was unlabeled, which was unusual because his mother labeled everything. "What's in here?" Claire asked. Inside were tax documents, old bank statements, a manila folder with the consultancy name on the front, and underneath all of it, a smaller envelope. Mitchell opened it. Inside was a printed email exchange, the kind you print when you want a record. The sender was his mother. The recipient was Scott Parrish. The thread went back 12 years. The timestamps were clear. The content was unambiguous. Mitchell sat down on the garage floor. Claire read over his shoulder and said nothing for a long time. He'd been 16 when his father left. He remembered his mother sitting him down at the kitchen table and explaining, very carefully, in the measured tone she used when delivering difficult news, that his father had been struggling, that the pressures of work had affected him, that he'd made a decision that was hurtful, but that Mitchell shouldn't blame himself. He'd been 22 for 3 years now. He'd told people, his mates, his girlfriend's parents, new colleagues at work, that his dad had walked out when he was 16. He'd said it so many times it had become a simple fact, one of the fixed coordinates of his life. He sat on the garage floor and read the emails twice. Claire said quietly, "Mitchell, that's 12 years ago. You were 10. He was already on it when she'd already told you he'd had a breakdown." "I know," Mitchell said. He called his mother. "Mum," he said when she answered. "The box in the garage. Third shelf. The unlabeled one. What's in there?" A pause. "Too long. Just old paperwork." "Don't worry about that. I've got it open, Mum." The pause that followed was a different kind of pause. "Mitchell," she said carefully, "whatever you think you're reading, it's not the whole story. Your father wasn't easy to live with. I was lonely. People make mistakes." 12 years, he said. "People make mistakes," she said again. He hung up. He drove to his mate Brendan's place, sat at his kitchen table, and stared at his hands for an hour while Brendan made tea and didn't push. Then he took out his phone and found his father's number in an old-school email. His mum had given it out once, years back, in case of emergency, and he stared at it for another 10 minutes. Then he typed, "This is Mitchell. I found some things. I need to talk to you." The response came 2 hours later. "I know this doesn't fix anything, but I never stopped thinking about you. If you want to talk, I'm here. Arthur." Mitchell read it 3 times. Then he typed back, "I'm coming to Bright this weekend. Is that okay?" The answer was a single word. Yes. He arrived on a Saturday morning, earlier than expected. Coming up the mountain road in Claire's car, she'd insisted on driving. Said she didn't trust him to navigate in the state he was in. He was quiet the whole last hour, watching the hills change. I was on the porch when I heard the car. I'd been up since 5. Frank was across the road on his veranda, drinking his first coffee, keeping his distance but staying visible. Mitchell got out and stood at the gate. He looked like me. That was the first thing I thought. Same build, same way of holding himself slightly forward, like he's expecting something. He had his mother's eyes, though. Direct, searching. He looked at the house, at the hills behind it, at me. Then he opened the gate and walked up to the porch. We didn't hug. We stood about 2 meters apart and looked at each other like two people trying to remember the language for something. "Tell me," he said. "From the start. Your version." So I did. I told him about the email. I told him about the 4 years, which meant it had started when he was 10. Something I watched him absorb with a very still face. I told him about asking her to end it, about the 3 nights in the spare room, about driving away on the Friday. I told him I'd been wrong, to stay silent, that I'd told myself I was protecting him, and that was partly true. But the other part was that I was afraid he wouldn't believe me. that his mother's version had had months to set before I ever had a chance to offer mine. "You could have written," he said. "I wrote a letter. Didn't send it." I looked at my hands. "I didn't think I had the right to blow up your life a second time. It was already blown up." Mitchell's voice was careful, not angry, more like a man working something out in real time. "You just weren't there to see it." "I know. There's no defense for that." He was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the ridge, the way it does in the morning, moving through the ash trees on the slope. "She told me you had a mental health episode," he said, "that you were unstable, that it wasn't safe for me to try to contact you." I looked at him. He held my gaze. "I had a broken heart," I said. "That's all. I knew exactly what I was doing when I left. I just didn't know how to come back." Frank appeared then, coming across the road with 2 extra mugs, setting them on the porch table without a word. Mitchell watched him. "Who's he?" "My neighbor. He's the reason I'm not in Western Australia right now." Frank extended his hand. Mitchell shook it, uncertain. "I've been keeping an eye on your father for about 6 years, Frank said. "Figured someone should." He turned and went back inside without further explanation. Mitchell watched him go. Then he looked at me. He brought out the document box a while later. Frank had carried it across when I waved him over. Mitchell went through it, folder by folder, slowly, while I made more tea and left him to it. He read the forged power of attorney. He read the superannuation withdrawal records. He read the statements from Helen Quigley, the 2 teachers, the cricket coach. He was very quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She's been telling everyone at her school that you walked out during a breakdown. I know. People think he stopped. They think you just couldn't cope." "Yeah." He closed the folder. "And you've just been up here." "Just been up here," I said. "Yeah." He exhaled slowly through his nose, the way I do when I'm trying not to let something hit me too hard, too fast. The legal meeting was 2 days later. Susan Calvert came up from Wangaratta. Ian Dorset drove down from Toowoomba. Frank brought his box. Helen Quigley drove up from Sydney. Mitchell sat beside me at my kitchen table. My wife arrived with Derek Marsh at 10 o'clock on the dot. She came up the porch steps in the same cream blazer she'd worn the first time, and she stopped when she saw the table. She saw Mitchell. She saw the folders. She saw Susan's face, which was the professional blankness of someone holding very good cards. Derek, to his credit or discredit, depending on how you look at it, read the room immediately. "Mrs. Fenwick, I'd like a moment before we proceed." My wife looked at Mitchell. Something moved across her face, surprise, maybe, or the specific fear of a story unraveling. Mitchell didn't look away. Susan laid out the documentation. The original asset schedule. The forged power of attorney Ian had cross-referenced signatures against original incorporation documents, and they were clearly different hands. The superannuation withdrawal trail. Helen's photographs. The witness statements. Derek Marsh put down his pen at the point where Susan showed the false statutory declaration. "Mrs. Fenwick," he said, "I need to advise you that I cannot continue to represent you in this matter. These documents indicate potential criminal liability that is well outside the scope of our engagement." He stood. "Mr. Dorset," he nodded to Ian, "I'd appreciate a copy of that incorporation document for our records." He left. My wife stood in my kitchen with her folder and no lawyer. "Scott isn't here," Mitchell said. He said it flatly, looking at his mother. "Didn't come for moral support this time?" "Mitch, don't. I'm just noting it." She looked at me. Her face had the expression of a person recalculating in real time, looking for exits, finding them closed. "I did what I had to do," she said. "You left me. I had a child to protect. I had a house to maintain. You made a unilateral decision and disappeared. You had a 4-year affair, Mitchell said. Before he even knew. 10 years old, Mum. I was 10. She didn't answer that. Susan placed the settlement documents on the table. The terms were straightforward. Full restitution of the superannuation funds. Signed withdrawal of all legal claims. A written acknowledgement of the forged documents to be held in trust, not made public, so long as she complied with the other conditions, and she was to have no further contact with me. My wife read the documents. Her hands were steady. I'll give her that. If I don't sign, she said. Then we file the criminal complaint, Susan said. Document forgery and fraudulent misrepresentation. That becomes public record. My wife looked at Mitchell one more time. A long look. The look of a mother who has done something that cannot be fully undone and knows it. Then she signed. When she was gone, the house felt very quiet. Frank made coffee. Ian stayed for lunch. Susan left with the signed documents and promised to follow up with the superannuation fund directly. Mitchell sat at the table after everyone else had moved to the porch. He had the folder from Helen Quigley in front of him, the photographs, and he was looking at one of them. His mother and Scott Parrish at what looked like a school trivia night, smiling at each other. He was 10 years old in that photo. Same year it was taken. He put it down. He came outside. He sat in the 4th chair. Frank had brought out the extra one without being asked, and we all looked at the hills for a while without saying much. What happens now? Mitchell asked. With us. I don't know, I said. That depends on you. I'm not going anywhere. He nodded slowly. His phone had been buzzing quietly for an hour. His mother, I assumed. He turned it over on his knee, screen down, and left it. After Frank went home and Ian drove back to Toowoomba, Mitchell and I sat on the porch until the sun was completely gone behind the ridge. He told me about his job. He was a project manager for an engineering firm in Brisbane, had been for 2 years. He told me about Claire, who was still sitting in the village reading a book and giving us space, which he said was exactly the kind of person she was. He told me about the cricket, that he still played socially, that his game had actually improved. I told him about the consultancy I'd started quietly 6 months ago, small residential builds, word of mouth. Told him about Frank, about Barry Spate, about how I'd ended up in Bright. We talked carefully, in the way of two people who don't know yet how much weight the new bridge will hold, but are willing to walk onto it anyway. Before he left the next morning, standing by Claire's car in the clear autumn light, he looked at me for a long moment. I've got a lot to work out, he said. Take your time. He nodded. Then, I'm not saying I understand everything you did, but I understand some of it now. The leaving part. Maybe not the silence after. The silence was wrong, I said. I'll say that every time you need to hear it. He held out his hand. I shook it. It wasn't a hug, but it was real. A beginning rather than a conclusion, which is the only honest way those things ever start again. He came back to Bright 2 months later with Claire, who turned out to be extremely good company and had opinions about local architecture that I found genuinely interesting. Then again at Easter, then again when his mate Brendan drove up for a long weekend and the 3 of them stayed in the little rental up the hill. Frank never made a fuss about any of it. He'd come across for a coffee when there were people about, sit for an hour, say little, then go home. Mitchell asked me once, after he'd known Frank a few months, what his story was. I told him the short version: estranged daughter, long years alone, a man who decided to spend his savings on someone else's reckoning rather than let the same mistake compound across another generation. That's Mitchell paused. That's something. Yeah, I said. Frank's daughter, a woman named Adele, had rung him around the time my wife came back to Bright. Mitchell being there, the legal proceedings, whatever Frank had told her about why something had cracked open in that conversation. She'd come up with her kids in January. It had been difficult and honest, and she'd come back in April. Life has a way, sometimes, of spreading when you let truth move through it. My wife completed her community service requirements without incident. She returned the superannuation funds over a 12-month payment plan. She didn't contact me again. Scott Parrish. I've heard he and my wife are still together. I don't think much about it. That chapter closed when she signed those papers. I still split my own kindling. Still drink at the Bright Brewery on Friday evenings. Still watch the ash trees do their thing in autumn. But there's a second cup on the porch table most mornings now, sometimes Mitchell's, sometimes Frank's, once or twice Claire's when she's come up ahead of him. It's a different kind of quiet than before. There's something I've thought about a lot in the time, since something I'd say to any man or woman sitting in a car with the engine running and a clear road ahead. Leaving isn't always cowardice. Sometimes it's the only decision that keeps you intact. But silence after leaving, that's a different thing. Silence protects you, yes. But it also leaves the people you love to fill the space with whatever story they're given. And the people who've wronged you will always be willing to provide a story. The truth is worth the mess of telling it. Not for your own vindication, though that matters too, but because the people who love you deserve to know what they're actually standing on. You cannot rebuild something real on a foundation the other person is still pretending is solid. And one more thing, which Frank said to me the morning after everything resolved, leaning on my fence post with his coffee. It takes longer to repair damage that wasn't yours to begin with, he said. Give it time, but don't give it excuses. There's a difference between patience and avoidance. Make sure you know which one you're practicing. I think about that most days. The porch holds 2 chairs now, sometimes 3. That's enough. That's more than enough. I've thought a lot about what this whole thing actually cost, not in dollars. Though that part was real enough, but in years. 6 years of Mitchell believing a version of his father that wasn't true. 6 years of my wife's story going unchallenged, while I split kindling in the hills and told myself I was keeping the peace. The honest reckoning is this. Actions don't stay contained. When my wife chose to run a parallel life for 4 years, she didn't just betray me, she built a structure of deception that eventually had to be maintained with more deception. The forged documents, the false power of attorney, the story she fed Mitchell about a breakdown that never happened. Each lie required another to hold it up. That's not bad luck. That's the natural weight of a life built on dishonesty finally reaching the point where it can't carry itself anymore. I'm not saying I did everything right. I didn't. Leaving was the correct decision, I'd do it again, but the silence that followed, that was mine to own. I told myself I was protecting Mitchell from a second blow, and maybe there was some truth in that. But I was also afraid. Afraid he'd choose her story over mine. Afraid I'd do all that damage and still lose him. Fear dressed up as consideration is still just fear. I knew that by the time he was standing in my driveway in Bright, and I said it to him plainly. Because there's no dignity in dressing it up, what Mitchell did driving up that mountain road after finding those emails. Asking hard questions, instead of retreating into the version of events he'd been living with, that took something. It takes a particular kind of character to look at a story you've held for years and say, this might not be right, and I need to find out. Most people don't do that. It's uncomfortable, and it costs you. But the alternative is building your understanding of the world on a foundation someone else laid for you, and never knowing whether it's solid. Frank is the part of this story I think about most. A man who spent his own savings quietly, without being asked, without any guarantee it would ever matter, building a case for a neighbor he barely knew. Not because he expected anything back, because he'd once been in the same position and chosen distance and spent 40 years carrying the weight of that choice. He decided, at 71, that he could either keep living with that regret or do something useful with it. That's what wisdom looks like when it's actually earned, not advice given freely to strangers, but a man getting in his car and driving to Toowoomba 4 times because he decided someone else's truth was worth preserving. I think about the decisions we make in the quiet moments, the engine running, the gate open, the road clear ahead. Those are the moments that shape more than we admit, not the dramatic confrontations, not the legal proceedings, but the ordinary Tuesday morning when you decide whether to stay and face it or point the car somewhere easier. The porch has more chairs on it now. That's the result of choosing to stay. Choose your life with your eyes open. Tell the truth, even when it's messy. And if you find yourself keeping someone else's silence to protect yourself, examine that honestly. Because silence has a cost, and it usually gets paid by the people you love most.